I'm a 26-year-old guy, fresh out of college, and trying to figure out life when everything took a dramatic turn. My grandfather passed away at 89 last month. He wasn't just grandpa to me, he was my favorite person, hands down. He had this no-nonsense charm mixed with a wicked sense of humor, and he was one of those people who could light up a room without even trying. He practically helped raise me since my parents divorced when I was 10. Let's just say family dynamics have been messy ever since, and his house was my escape. The funeral was hard, but what came after? Total chaos. Grandpa didn't just leave behind a legacy of being an all-around legend, he left a mountain of wealth no one saw coming. He lived modestly, no flashy cars or extravagant vacations, but apparently he'd been quietly building up a serious fortune through investments over the years. His biggest asset, though, was the family's ancestral home, this old but beautiful estate that's been in the family for generations. Now, I didn't think much about the will at first. I assumed my parents and aunts and uncles would handle all of that. I figured maybe I'd get one of Grandpa's watches or some sentimental trinket. Boy, was I wrong. When the lawyer called for a family meeting to read the will, tensions were already sky high. My family has always been, well, dramatic. There's my mom and dad, who still can't have a civil conversation unless a lawyer is present. Then there's my Uncle Richard, who thinks the world owes him everything, and Aunt Linda, who turns every family gathering into a battlefield. And let's not forget my cousin Jenny, the golden child everyone dotes on. She's younger than me, barely 20, and she's been treated like royalty her entire life. We all crammed into Grandpa's living room, the same one where I'd spent countless weekends playing chess with him. It felt surreal. The lawyer showed up with this thick, sealed envelope, making the whole thing feel like the start of some dramatic movie. Everyone was whispering and speculating. Some thought the house would go to Uncle Richard because he's the eldest. Others said it would be split equally among Grandpa's kids. Nobody even considered me in the equation, not that I blamed them. I stayed quiet, just trying to keep my head down. The will started off as expected. Grandpa left sentimental items to specific people, a pocket watch to Uncle Richard, a collection of rare coins to Aunt Linda, and a bunch of family photos to my mom. Then came the bombshell. The lawyer announced that Grandpa had left the ancestral home to me, my name, out loud. I swear you could hear a pin drop in the room. Everyone turned to stare at me like I'd just stolen something. Uncle Richard actually laughed, thinking it was a mistake, but the lawyer repeated it. Grandpa left the house to me, and only me. That's when the yelling started. Uncle Richard accused me of manipulating Grandpa. Aunt Linda said Grandpa must have been senile when he wrote the will. Jenny just sat there, glaring at me like I'd stolen her crown. My mom tried to calm things down, but it was like throwing water on a grease fire. The room was a mess of raised voices, accusations, and pure chaos. Then the lawyer dropped the second bomb. Apparently, Grandpa didn't stop at just giving me the house. He'd included a clause that would determine what happened to the rest of his estate, money, investments, everything. The catch? The entire family had to spend 1 full year living together in the ancestral home. No selling assets, no lawsuits, no walking out. If anyone broke the rules, the inheritance would be void, and all the money would go to charity. You can imagine how that went over. Uncle Richard started yelling about how ridiculous it was. Aunt Linda threatened to contest the will on the spot. Even my mom, who's usually the calm one, looked like she was going to lose it. Jenny didn't say much, but her expression said it all. She was already plotting her way out of this mess. The lawyer explained that I was the mediator, tasked with monitoring the family and reporting back to him. If we couldn't manage a year together, we'd lose everything. By the end of the meeting, I wasn't sure if I wanted to laugh, cry, or run for the hills. Grandpa had always loved his mind games, but this was next level stuff. The family left in a mix of fury and disbelief, and I just sat there in the empty house, staring at the lawyer. That was just the beginning, he said, packing up his papers. Good luck. You're going to need it. And he wasn't kidding. If the first 24 hours were anything to go by, I was about to be dragged into the most dysfunctional reality show no one ever asked for. Update 1. The day after the will reading was pure chaos. My phone didn't stop buzzing, with calls and texts flying in from every family member who had something to say, none of it good. Uncle Richard was the loudest, declaring the whole thing unfair and swearing he'd already contacted a lawyer to contest the will. He said Grandpa must have been manipulated, and even though no one openly agreed with him, it was clear he wasn't alone in his feelings. Aunt Linda, on the other hand, took a different route. She called me directly, trying to convince me that the clause was ridiculous, and that we should work together to split the estate fairly. Translation: she thought I'd be easier to manipulate than the lawyer. I told her I wasn't making any decisions until I talked to the lawyer again, which didn't go over well. Then there was my mom and dad. They haven't spoken much since their divorce, but now they suddenly had plenty to say about my role as mediator. My mom thought I should honor Grandpa's wishes, no matter how difficult it was. She said the house was my responsibility now, and I needed to take the mediator role seriously. My dad? Total opposite. He told me to sell the house, move on, and let the family fight it out in court. It's not your problem, he said. Don't let them drag you into their mess. By the time the day ended, I felt like I was already in over my head. Then came the surprise twist. Jenny, my younger cousin and the family favorite, volunteered to stay in the house with me. This is the same Jenny who usually stayed out of family drama unless she was being pampered. Now, she suddenly wanted to play housemate? It didn't sit right with me, but I figured I couldn't handle this alone, so I agreed. The first family meeting to discuss logistics was a disaster. I'd sent out a group message, thinking we could all sit down like adults and figure out how to make this work. Big mistake. Uncle Richard and Aunt Linda spent the entire time arguing about who contributed more to Grandpa's care in his final years. My mom and dad had their own awkward tension, sitting on opposite sides of the room and barely making eye contact. Meanwhile, Jenny just scrolled through her phone, completely unbothered. At one point, someone brought up house rules, which immediately turned into a shouting match. Richard said he wouldn't follow any rules because he didn't even believe in the clause. Linda accused him of trying to sabotage everything so no one would get the inheritance. I tried to keep things on track, but it was like herding cats. The meeting ended with Richard storming out and Linda muttering about how this family is impossible. A day later, the lawyer called with a warning. If anyone formally contested the will, the clause would kick in, and the entire estate would go to charity. That got everyone's attention, at least for a while, but the truce didn't last long. A few days later, someone posted about the drama on Facebook. They didn't name names, but it was obvious they were talking about the family. Suddenly, neighbors and distant relatives were chiming in with opinions, turning the whole thing into a public spectacle. Linda called me, furious, and demanded to know who leaked it. I had no idea, but based on the passive-aggressive tone of the post, I had my suspicions. The first month in the house was worse than I expected. Grandpa's clause required everyone to live there, but that turned out to be a bigger challenge than anyone thought. Uncle Richard lasted exactly 2 weeks before packing up and leaving. He said the conditions were unlivable, though I'm pretty sure it had more to do with losing arguments than anything else. Aunt Linda stuck around, but she wasn't exactly making things easier. Every other day, she'd make some passive-aggressive comment about how I was just a kid and couldn't possibly manage this responsibility. With Richard gone, I had to step up as the mediator. I set some basic house rules, things like cleaning up after yourself and keeping common areas quiet at night. Jenny, to my surprise, actually followed the rules and even helped enforce them. Linda, not so much. I caught her sneaking snacks into the living room and leaving dishes in the sink more times than I could count. Things took a turn when I found the first letter from Grandpa. It was hidden in the back of his old desk drawer, sealed in an envelope with my name on it. The letter didn't say much, just a few lines about how he hoped the house would bring the family together and how he trusted me to make the right decisions. It wasn't much, but it gave me a little clarity about why he'd set everything up this way. Then came the real blow. Linda tried to sell her share of the inheritance. She called up a realtor to appraise part of the property, apparently thinking no one would notice. Jenny overheard her on the phone and immediately told me. I confronted Linda, who tried to play dumb at first but eventually admitted it. She said she deserved her share and couldn't wait around for the rest of us to figure things out. I had no idea what to do, reporting her could void the entire inheritance, but letting it slide felt like betraying Grandpa's trust. And that was just the first month. If things were already this messy, I couldn't imagine how the rest of the year would go. Update 2. Confronting Linda about her attempted sale was like lighting a fuse. She didn't even try to deny it for long. Instead, she spun it into an argument about fairness, claiming she was just taking what was rightfully hers. She demanded that I let it slide, but I knew the clause was clear. Violating it could put the entire inheritance at risk. Tensions boiled over, and the shouting echoed through the house. Jenny overheard and came to watch the fireworks, but instead of backing me up, she smirked like she was enjoying the show. By the end of the day, Linda had stormed off to her room, muttering something about lawyers and how this isn't over. That night, she started pulling family members into private conversations, working to form a voting bloc against me. I'd hear whispers in the kitchen or muffled voices behind closed doors. It didn't take long to figure out what she was up to. She was trying to pressure me into ignoring the clause entirely, as if we could just pretend it didn't exist. Uncle Richard, even though he'd technically left the house, was calling in support from the sidelines, fanning the flames. Meanwhile, Jenny's behavior shifted. She started accidentally stirring up conflict. If I set a rule, she'd forget and leave dirty dishes everywhere or blast music late at night. It seemed minor at first, but then she started baiting Linda into fights over petty things. When Linda snapped, Jenny would play the victim, complaining loudly about how impossible it was to live with certain people. She was clearly trying to make life unbearable for Linda, hoping she'd leave and narrow the pool of potential heirs. It was a clever strategy, but it only added fuel to the fire. The next major blow came when an old family secret resurfaced. One of Grandpa's letters mentioned the importance of honesty and hinted at hidden truths. While sorting through some of Grandpa's belongings in the attic, I stumbled across an old photo album that didn't seem unusual at first. But tucked inside was a letter, one that exposed a decades-old affair involving Uncle Richard. I didn't even know if Grandpa had been aware of it, but somehow the secret got out. Richard's wife, who had stayed quiet until now, was furious. She showed up at the house unannounced, throwing accusations and demanding answers. It was a public spectacle that spilled out onto the front lawn, and half the neighborhood probably heard the shouting. Richard tried to deny it at first, but eventually admitted it was true. The fallout was immediate. His wife packed her bags and left him, threatening divorce. Amidst all this chaos, I found an unexpected ally in my mom's youngest sister, Aunt Rachel. She'd always been the quiet one at family gatherings, the type who stayed on the sidelines and avoided drama. But now she stepped up, offering to help me enforce house rules in immediate disputes. She wasn't confrontational, but she had a knack for calming people down, at least temporarily. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't completely alone in this. Then the house itself started to fall apart, almost as if it was reflecting the state of our family. The plumbing backed up, the roof started leaking, and the ancient boiler decided to quit. Fixing it all would take teamwork, but getting everyone to cooperate was a nightmare. Rachel and I managed to convince a few family members to pitch in for repairs, but Linda refused to lift a finger, and Jenny conveniently disappeared every time work needed to be done. Still, those rare moments of collaboration gave me a glimpse of what Grandpa might have hoped for. Another letter from Grandpa turned up during the repairs, hidden behind a loose floorboard in the study. This one was more personal. He acknowledged that he expected chaos but believed that forcing us to live together might help us mend old wounds. The house can be rebuilt, he wrote, but it's the family that matters. It felt almost ironic, considering the state of things. The infighting over the assets didn't stop either. Even with the clause hanging over us, people were still trying to divide things up in their minds, arguing about who deserved what. Linda brought up the offshore account Grandpa had hidden, claiming it should go to her because she did the most for him in his final years. Jenny chimed in, saying it should be split among the grandkids. It was endless. Then came the blackmail attempt. Jenny approached me one night with a smug look, holding a printed email she claimed proved I'd been favoring certain family members. It was laughable, she'd clearly faked it, but she threatened to share it with the lawyer unless I backed her in the inheritance arguments. I told her to do whatever she wanted and walked away. She didn't expect that response, and for once, she didn't have anything to say. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I discovered an old safe in the basement while searching for tools to fix the boiler. It was locked tight, and none of Grandpa's letters mentioned it. I had no idea what was inside, but it felt significant, like another piece of the puzzle. Despite everything, there was one moment of peace. We all worked together to patch the roof during a rainstorm. For a few hours, there was no arguing, no scheming, just teamwork. It didn't last, of course, but it gave me a sliver of hope. Later that night, I managed to get the safe open. Inside was a folder with documents that could change everything. But as I read through them, my heart sank. Grandpa had one last twist in store for us, and it was about to throw the family into even deeper turmoil. Update 3. When I finally opened the safe, the first thing I noticed was a stack of old photos, some bank documents, and tucked underneath everything, a sealed letter with my name on it. I knew it was from Grandpa before I even opened it. He'd always had a dramatic flair, and this felt exactly like something he'd do. The letter was short but packed a punch. He explained that he had expected the family to fight over the inheritance, and that this was his attempt to force everyone to confront their issues. Then came the twist, a second clause. According to Grandpa, this clause wasn't included in the formal reading of the will because it only applied if someone broke specific conditions, ones he deliberately kept vague. If triggered, the clause would completely disinherit the violator, cutting them out of the estate entirely. There was no way to tell who might be affected or what would activate it, but Grandpa hinted that it had to do with betrayal or deceit. I knew this would only make things worse, so I decided not to tell anyone about it yet. It was a gamble, but with the way things were already spiraling, throwing this into the mix felt like a recipe for disaster. The bank documents were another bombshell. One of them revealed an offshore account Grandpa had kept hidden, holding a significant amount of money, enough to change the stakes entirely. The account wasn't mentioned in the original will, and there were no clear instructions about how it was supposed to be distributed. I tucked everything back into the safe and locked it, unsure of what to do next. Word got out about the safe almost immediately. I don't know if someone saw me with it or if people were just snooping, but by the next day, the entire house was buzzing with speculation. Linda cornered me in the kitchen, demanding to know what I'd found. Jenny, of course, turned it into an opportunity. She was caught rifling through my room later that night, clearly hoping to find the letter or the documents. When I confronted her, she didn't even try to deny it. Instead, she accused me of hiding things from the family and said I was trying to cheat everyone out of their fair share. The confrontation escalated quickly, and the shouting drew everyone into the living room. Jenny played the victim again, claiming I was hoarding secrets and refusing to share Grandpa's wishes with the rest of the family. It wasn't just Linda backing her up this time. Even Uncle Richard, still bitter from the sidelines, chimed in over a video call, accusing me of using the mediator role to manipulate the situation. Amid the chaos, Aunt Rachel stepped up. She'd been the quiet one, but now she spoke firmly, pointing out that the family had been tearing itself apart long before Grandpa's will. She suggested that everyone stop speculating and focus on the bigger picture, fixing the house and making it through the year. For a moment, things calmed down. Rachel's support was unexpected, but it helped shift the conversation away from me. The house repairs continued, but cooperation was minimal at best. The roof was leaking again, and the basement had started flooding after a heavy rain. Rachel and I worked on patching things up, but Linda refused to help, claiming she was too stressed from the ongoing drama. Jenny hovered around, pretending to pitch in, but mostly finding excuses to leave whenever real work started. At one point, Richard showed up unannounced with a contractor, claiming he had a better solution for the roof. The contractor didn't last long after Richard started yelling about money. Then came Linda's breakdown. One afternoon, she started screaming in the living room, accusing everyone of conspiring against her. She brought up old grievances, like how she felt unappreciated for taking care of Grandpa in his final years. It turned into a full-blown scene, with her sobbing and threatening to leave the house altogether. For a moment, I thought she might actually go, but she calmed down after Rachel talked her down. To try and bring some order, I called another family meeting. This one wasn't any better than the first. Half the family showed up late, and the other half didn't bother to take it seriously. Rachel and I laid out some basic boundaries: no snooping, no undermining house repairs, and no more public outbursts. Richard, who was still attending virtually, made snide comments throughout, and Jenny kept rolling her eyes. It felt like no one was listening. The final blow came when Richard accused me of hiding the offshore account. He claimed he'd heard rumors about Grandpa having extra money, and that I was keeping it for myself. The accusation spread through the family like wildfire, and even Rachel couldn't completely defuse it. Trust within the family, already fragile, crumbled even further. The lawyer called later that evening with an ominous update. Someone, somewhere, had violated the conditions of the will, and the second clause might soon be activated. He didn't specify who was responsible or what the violation was, but the message was clear. Things were about to get even messier. As I hung up the phone, I couldn't help but wonder if Grandpa had known it would all come to this, or if even he had underestimated just how deep the cracks in our family ran. Update 4. The lawyer's call came with the news we'd all been dreading. Someone had violated the conditions of Grandpa's will, and the second clause had officially been triggered. He wouldn't say who was responsible, only that the violation was tied to an attempt to sell assets. It didn't take long to connect the dots. Linda's secret deal with the realtor had sealed her fate. The fallout was immediate. Linda was officially disinherited, and she didn't take the news quietly. She stormed into the living room with a mix of anger and desperation, shouting about how unfair it was and blaming everyone else for her actions. Her next move, however, took things to another level. She threatened to expose every family secret she could think of, unless we compensated her for the loss of her inheritance. Her threats were wild affairs, financial mismanagement, and even accusations of illegal activities. Most of it sounded like exaggeration, but the damage was done. The room erupted into chaos as everyone turned on each other, either denying Linda's claims or trying to deflect attention. I realized in that moment that if I didn't step up, the situation would only get worse. I stood my ground, refusing to let Linda intimidate me or the rest of the family. It wasn't easy, especially with her accusing me of being Grandpa's favorite and using that to take control. But as the mediator, I knew I had to hold firm. I reminded everyone that if they didn't cooperate, the entire inheritance could still go to charity. The next morning, Uncle Richard announced he was leaving the house. He said the situation was beyond saving and that he couldn't stay in such a toxic environment. Nobody tried to stop him. In fact, his departure brought a brief sense of relief, one less person to argue with. But it also meant fewer participants in the clause, which made the stakes even higher for those of us who remained. That evening, my parents, who had been relatively quiet through all of this, finally snapped. They got into a heated argument about their divorce, each blaming the other for how the family had turned out. My mom accused my dad of being absent when it mattered most, while my dad shot back that she was too controlling. Their fight dragged up old wounds and spilled over into the rest of us, forcing Rachel and me to intervene just to keep the peace. Meanwhile, Jenny wasted no time trying to take advantage of the situation. With Linda disinherited and Richard gone, she started acting like she was in charge. She made a show of helping with repairs and even tried to rally some of the remaining family members to her side. It was clear she was angling for the best possible outcome for herself, but her efforts only added to the tension. As the chaos continued, I decided to take a closer look at the offshore account mentioned in the safe. After some digging, I discovered that Grandpa had set it up as a contingency fund for the upkeep of the ancestral home. He'd been preparing for the possibility that the family might not come together, and this account was his way of ensuring the house could survive on its own. It was another reminder of how much thought he'd put into this whole situation. While sorting through some of Grandpa's belongings in the attic, I found another letter. This one was different. It was addressed to the entire family. In it, Grandpa acknowledged that he knew the inheritance would bring out the worst in us, but he still believed the house could be a place of healing if we let it. He wrote about the importance of family unity and how much he regretted the distance that had grown between us over the years. Inspired by the letter, I proposed that we hold a memorial dinner for Grandpa as a way to honor his memory and maybe, just maybe, bring everyone together. Surprisingly, most of the family agreed. For one night, the arguing stopped. We cooked a meal together, shared stories about Grandpa, and even managed to laugh. It was a rare moment of unity, but like everything else, it didn't last. A few days later, Linda's threats came back to haunt her. Someone, probably Jenny, leaked that Linda had been embezzling money from Grandpa's care fund before his death. The revelation was explosive, and the family had no choice but to involve the police. Linda denied everything, of course, but the evidence was damning. The legal drama added a whole new layer of stress to an already unbearable situation. With everything spiraling out of control, I decided to fully embrace my role as mediator. I laid down an ultimatum: either we follow the rules of Grandpa's will and work together, or we risk losing everything. There was no room for negotiation. For the first time, I saw some of the family members actually take me seriously. Just when it seemed like things might finally stabilize, I found another letter from Grandpa hidden in the study. This one contained a shocking revelation that could change the stakes entirely. As I read the words, I realized that the drama was far from over, and that the hardest part of this journey was still ahead of us. Update 5. The letter I found wasn't just another note from Grandpa. It was his final message to the family, written as a contingency plan if all else failed. The instructions were clear: if the family couldn't meet the conditions of the will and live together peacefully for a year, the entire estate, including the offshore account, the house, and all investments, would be donated to charity. There were no exceptions, no loopholes. It was an all-or-nothing deal. When I gathered everyone in the living room to read the letter, the reaction was exactly what I expected: total disbelief. Linda, still reeling from being disinherited, accused me of fabricating the letter to control the situation. Richard joined in via video call, claiming it was all too convenient. Jenny sat quietly for once, her eyes darting between me and the letter, as if calculating her next move. The lawyer arrived later that day to confirm the letter's validity. With his backing, there was no denying Grandpa's intentions. The room fell silent for the first time in weeks, as the reality of the situation sank in. This wasn't just about individual shares anymore. The entire inheritance was at stake. The lawyer gave us one final chance: comply with the clause for the remainder of the year, or watch everything go to charity. Linda was the first to break. She packed her bags and announced she was leaving for good. Her parting shot was a mix of bitterness and regret, claiming that Grandpa had set us all up to fail. While her departure eased the tension in the house, it also left behind a sense of guilt. No one wanted to admit it, but losing a family member, even one as combative as Linda, felt like a loss for all of us. The real surprise came from Jenny. After weeks of manipulation and scheming, she stood up during dinner one night and apologized. She admitted to stirring the pot and trying to play everyone against each other. Her voice cracked as she talked about how Grandpa had always believed in her potential and how she felt she'd let him down. It wasn't the most eloquent apology, but it was genuine enough to catch everyone off guard. For the first time, I saw a glimpse of the person Grandpa must have seen in her. With fewer people in the house, things started to shift. Rachel and I led the charge to finish restoring the ancestral home, and to my surprise, the rest of the family followed suit. The roof repairs, which had been delayed by constant arguments, were finally completed. The basement was drained and waterproofed, and the overgrown garden was brought back to life. It was slow, frustrating work, but there was something oddly therapeutic about it. One of Grandpa's last letters described the house as a symbol of unity. If you can rebuild the house, he wrote, you can rebuild the family. At the time, it felt overly sentimental, but as we worked together to bring the house back to its former glory, I started to see what he meant. Even Richard, who wasn't physically present, contributed by wiring money to help cover the costs. It wasn't much, but it was a step in the right direction. The turning point came when we decided to host a memorial dinner for Grandpa. Everyone pitched in, from cooking to setting the table. For the first time in months, the house felt warm and alive. We shared stories about Grandpa, laughed at his quirks, and even toasted to his infamous stubbornness. It was a rare moment of peace, and while it didn't erase the past few months, it gave us a glimpse of what could be possible. The lawyer returned at the end of the year to review our progress. By some miracle, we had narrowly met the conditions of the clause. Despite the early departures and endless drama, we'd managed to hold it together just enough to satisfy Grandpa's terms. The relief in the room was palpable. For the first time in months, it felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off our shoulders. With the clause fulfilled, the assets were finally divided. I made it a point to ensure everything was distributed fairly, taking Grandpa's wishes into account. The offshore account, which had been the subject of so much speculation, was revealed to be a safety net for the house's upkeep. We agreed to use it as a family trust, ensuring that the ancestral home would remain intact for future generations. As for me, I decided to move into the house permanently. It felt like the right thing to do, not just for me, but for Grandpa's legacy. The house wasn't just a building. It was a reminder of everything we'd been through and the lessons we'd learned along the way. Looking back, I know we'll never be the perfect family. There are still cracks in our relationships, and some wounds will take time to heal. But we've come a long way from where we started. Grandpa's plan, as wild as it was, worked in its own way. It forced us to confront our issues and find common ground, even when it felt impossible. As I sit in the study, reading through Grandpa's letters one last time, I can't help but smile. He always did have a way of seeing the bigger picture, even when we couldn't. Now, it's up to us to carry that vision forward.